I am Stacy Lightfoot and excited to be here. We are in the home stretch and this is the last session and our closing speaker today. Before we get started, I actually wanted to let the audience know how we got connected. After that, I'll read a brief bio for Dr. Reed and then we'll get the conversation started. So you all heard from Dr. Michelle Rigler earlier today, Executive Director of UTC's Disability Resource Center. And I work at UTC. I'm the Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Engagement. So Dr. Rigler sends me an article from a national publication called Inside Higher Ed. And the name of that article is Disability as Diversity. So Dr. Rigler sends me this article. It was a profound article, and Denise Reed from Biola University had some profound quotes in this article. And I said to myself, she would be a really good speaker for the Accessibility Summit. So Biola University is in California. We called her up and that is how she's here. So thank you to Dr. Rigler for sending me the article, but also for the Signal Centers team and Marge Fleming for making the connection to you. So I just wanted you all to know how we connected, but I also want you to know who it is I am sitting up here talking to. So allow me to introduce you to Dr. Denise Reed. Dr. Reed earned her PhD in education with an emphasis in disability studies from Chapman University and an MS in special education from California State University, Fullerton. She has 35 years experience in ensuring equitable education for students with disabilities. She has spent over a decade working with high school students in the transition from high school to college, post-secondary education with the provision of mandated accommodations for college students with disabilities as her main responsibilities. Her past research has focused on tensions experienced by college students as they negotiate their disabled and non-disabled identities. She is currently an associate professor at the School of Education, Biola University. Let's welcome to the stage Dr. Denise Reed, all the way here from California. Thank you so much for making the trip.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for making the trip, and thank you so much for taking a phone call from some folks in Chattanooga to come here. You have been here, and you've been here at this conference all day.
Yes.
You've heard some really, really good information, and what a
Yes.
dynamic experience it has been for you to be around like-minded people talking about things that you talk about all the time.
Yes.
So today's presentation and dialogue will be a tad bit different, and hopefully that that provides a really good conclusion for this session. This will be part conversation, but also part presentation. And you've come prepared with some slides for the audience and slides that will ground us in your message today. Again, Dr. Reed has been here the entire day, so she's gonna maybe reiterate a couple of points, but also ground us in this notion of disability as a diversity and how it intersects the intersectionality of disability as well. And I'm gonna share with you a quote before we get started and you expound upon this idea of disability being part or left out of the DEI conversation. Okay. And this is a quote from Dr. Reed that I read in the Disability as Diversity article from the Inside Higher Ed publication. You quote, "What I would like to see is a fuller integration and examination of the intersectionality between race and disability. I think disability is missing an entire aspect when the intersectionality of race and disability is ignored." And while you're going to talk about this intersectionality, I do want you to take a few moments to set the context for this dialogue and this presentation. So the microphone is yours. And the screen is yours, Dr. Reed. So glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just excited to be here today. And I have just enjoyed immensely the conversations today. And I'm just honored to be a part to end this session, this conference today, after hearing so many colleagues in the field that just have expertise. So thank you for having me here, and thank you for the invitation. You know, when I think about this conversation about diversity and how disability is absent from it, I think immediately that we're looking at a conversation that is basically incomplete and, in my opinion, superficial, because I believe, if you see here on the slides, we have the diversity categories that's gonna focus our attention on this intersectionality. And so the reason I said that if the conversation around the diversity does not include disability, we're just missing a whole piece, because all of these areas that we see here in terms of diversity, whether it's gender, religion, nationality, race, ethnicity, all of these categories make up individual identities. And someone said, I couldn't remember today, but earlier it was stated that we have multiple identities. And so just like people with disabilities, we have to consider two things: that a person with a disability also has a race or ethnicity. They come from a social class of some sort. And so what we know is that there has to be an intersectionality. And in order for the conversation to be complete, I went back to the grade school. We probably have all seen this Venn diagram when you probably were in the 3rd or 4th grade. But I think in order for us to have a complete conversation surrounding disability as diversity, we have to have this intersectionality. And so if we could just imagine the A part of this diagram as being disability, and B being made up of any of the other diversity categories, and always remember that the conversation needs to have an A and a B, and oftentimes it may have a C and a D. It could be a Black female with a disability, therefore it would have another circle in here. But the whole point is that the intersectionality would be where they all intersect. And so I believe that we cannot have a complete conversation surrounding diversity if we only have A. And I propose that we have A, and then as disability, and then B as any of the other categories, and possibly C. And it's important because far too often conversations surrounding diversity really just focus on race and ethnicity. And those are very valid points and are part of the diversity conversation and should not be ignored. However, I think we have really focused on race and ethnicity to the point where when we hear the term diversity, we automatically, some of us might shut down and think that that's the only thing it relates to. And so we have to think about that. And then because disability intersects with all the diversity categories, it's basically the largest diversity category, because we have individuals with disabilities from every religion, from every social class, different genders, different socioeconomic groups. And so there always is that intersectionality. And so according to the World Health Organization, about 15% of our world population report living with some sort of disability. So we're looking at about 1 billion people who identify as having a disability, and that's worldwide. And so it was said earlier, and I forgot the young lady's name, who actually mentioned that it is one of the categories that all of us at some point will have the opportunity to be a part of, whether it's you as you age, or maybe you're in a car accident, you have a bicycle accident, you fall off your bike, hit your head, and you have a traumatic brain injury. And so it's one of the categories that we all have an opportunity to be a part of. You don't have to be born into this category. Yeah.
So looking through your research, you talk about the definitions and this notion of disabilities being mental or social, or medical or social, medical or social. I think you have a slide prepared that kind of explains how you approach these two aspects and framing of disabilities.
Right. So when we think about these categories, let me just go back just a little bit to tell you, because we did talk a little bit about special education today. Special education in and of itself looks at what we would call in disability studies as a medical model, where that medical condition is the focus. The pathology is within the person. And oftentimes you'll hear it, not as much as we used to in the years past, but it's still the case that sometimes individuals might have a tendency to think that someone needs to be fixed, that the pathology is within the person. And so that's that medical model where everything is focused, well, what's wrong with that person? What can't that person do? Oh, that person is unable to come up these stairs. And so that's the medical model. It's the limitations that are placed on and is focused on the individual. Whereas when we look at the social model or that social definition, we're basically moving beyond the person and we're looking at environmental factors, attitudes, physical barriers that actually cause disability. And so in disability studies, there is some conversation surrounding the conversation of the difference between a disability and an impairment. And in disability studies, some would argue that really disability is constructed, because a person can have an impairment, a physiological impairment, without being disabled, given the appropriate accommodations, the structures. And so an example of that would be an individual who uses a wheelchair may have a physical impairment, but is not disabled unless they're in a building that does not have elevators, or a building that they can't have ramps in which they can't even enter. And so that's the idea behind the medical versus the social model. And what is important is in this, we really have to think about how we are socialized, what we have been trained and how we have been trained. And when I studied for special education, it wasn't until I went to begin my studies in my doctoral program that I actually understood the difference, because I was socialized into the medical model of disability until I learned that there was a social model. And so I found it very important to set those differences, because we have to think about what narrative are we listening to? Are we listening to the narrative that says that the person needs to be fixed, or are we looking at more social barriers and attitudes that need to be corrected?
That's a really good point. So disability has been absent from this conversation around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. In the employment realm, we've heard that today. In the P16 system, that's preschool all the way through college. And I also read that higher education systems have been challenged to develop the kinds of practices and policies that really advance access, retention, graduation for underrepresented populations, especially those who have disabilities. And those with disabilities are supposed to have this equal access to higher education mandated by the federal government. But I'm in higher ed, and I am starting to see a lot of those challenges as well. So as we've heard in these prior conversations, can you talk about the trends that you are seeing with employers, the trends that you are seeing, these patterns that you are seeing in these higher ed landscapes and the K-12 landscape, and help us understand where we go from here?
Well, I am not a an expert in the field of employment, but what I do know is that when we think about employment, we do have to think about the recruitment, because we had an excellent workshop, I must say that, a session on the workplace. So they covered a lot of valuable information already on that topic. But what I wanted to say in terms of the employment piece is that we really have to think about recruitment, retention, and the intentionality of employers to really look for individuals with disabilities as actively as they do racial and ethnic minorities. And so I think that's very important. I also think it's important to address issues regarding just statements, the statements that are made, that they're meaningful, and that they not only are a statement, but it's part of who they are. It's their ethos. It's embedded in them. And so I think also what's important is to think about the intentionality of providing services and accommodations, excuse me, for individuals who are employed. And they don't always have to be high tech. They can be low tech accommodations, which is equally as appropriate. And so I think some of the trends that I am aware of when it comes in terms of higher education, employment, is to think about companies that were mentioned that are intentional on letting individuals be their authentic self and not putting individuals within a box based on their idea of what their employee should be like. And then in terms of, I can't think, oh, I missed one. Okay, so I'm sorry about that. So I'm on higher ed now. Okay. And then I wanted to talk, you mentioned the other part for education, for higher ed. And because we know that there are going to be some individuals who are in our pre-K 12th grade system that go to colleges. There are, well, I think what I'll do is I'll do this. I'll talk about one study and then I'll come back to this. So in the state of California, we have one of the largest public higher education system, the Cal State system, the CSU system. And myself and some colleagues, we did what we called a snapshot click study of the California State University systems. And what we did is we wanted to know how disability was represented on their websites. And so it's a total of 23 campuses, and we took snapshots of their home pages at 2 different times over the course of 2 years. And of the 23 schools, only one actually associated disability with diversity on their webpage. In terms of that language, that dialogue. And what we began to notice from there was where disability was placed. And over 91% of those institutions from the California State University systems actually associated disability in student services and had nothing to do with diversity. And so when we think about higher education, we have to think about, if you're recruiting individual students with disabilities to come to your campus, they have to be included into the diversity conversation, because disability crosses all, remember I showed that earlier, all of the diversity categories. And so just like universities are actively recruiting racial and ethnic minority students, they should do the same thing when it comes to students with disabilities, because at some point there's going to be an intersectionality of a student who is racially and ethnically diverse and also has a disability. And so that's very important. Now, in terms of the study, one university, which was Cal State Fresno, was the only one that mandated, that had that conversation on their website. But what was interesting was when we went back the second time, the conversation was gone. And so we don't know what happened. That's the nature of the conversation, what happens. But what happens to students? And so at a glance, we had hope that this is good. But then when we went back, it was gone. And so research does show that there's issues when it comes to factors related to faculty's perception of students with disabilities. There's often, there's research to indicate that many professors, a substantial amount of professors, think that providing services and accommodations to students with disabilities gives that students a leg up, and it's advantage to other students. So that is something that we have to address. I do believe that the trend in higher education, I personally know of a few individuals who are either CDOs or vice chancellors of diversity on their campus that are really interested in changing the narrative. So I do see a trend in that, and I believe that the trend will start in higher education administration to make that change. And then when we look at the kindergarten through the elementary school, the K-12 system and pre-K, it's interesting because we see students in the education system, K-12, as diverse. So there's not a given there, right? There's nothing questioned. We see these students as diverse, but what happens is because of that diversity, many of these students are isolated. And so there we have another problem. And so here you have the identification of a diverse group of students, but it's because of that diversity that many of them are isolated. And so I understand that in K-12, we have what's called this tier, this continuum of where students can receive their services, and it's very appropriate. But I believe that because of the medical model of special education, many educators have bought into that in our school system, and hence they see the disability within the child and not the system, and not the environment. And so I believe we have far too many students that are spending too much time in separate classes that could be included to a greater degree.
How do you change that? Because we said the word systems a while. We've used the word conversations. How do you change that when it is baked into years and years of what higher ed institutions and what K-12 institutions are used to doing? Who is it up to spark that change, to change that conversation?
That's an interesting question, and one that I ponder quite often, because I think it's twofold. On one hand, I think it's related to how we train teachers. So I think teacher prep programs have to step up and really evaluate how we train teachers, and are we sending teachers out ill prepared? Because if I had anything to do with how all teachers were trained, there would not be a special education department. Because what happens is we have a narrative of this is often the narrative. You'll have a general ed teacher who will say, well, I didn't go to school to work with children with disabilities. Send them over to Mrs. Jones's class. She's the special teacher. She's patient. She can work with them. And so just basically get them out of my classroom and you go over there and work with that special teacher. And that's problematic because we have to think about just variation in general, not even disability, not even identified disabilities. Teachers will have children with a wide variety of skills in their classrooms that need to be addressed. And not only is it the responsibility of the special ed teacher to meet those children's need. So I think one way to do that is to address it through teacher prep training and how much teachers have special ed training that they're leaving with. And then two, I think as we change the way teachers are trained, we're going to eventually see that implemented into the schools. And let me say that in no way, in no mean am I saying that we don't have teachers who are doing decent work. We have hardworking teachers who are going above and beyond. So I don't want to imply that. I'm just saying that I think in many cases, many teachers feel inadequately prepared to serve students with special needs unless they have special ed background.
Really great perspective. I like to talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as a mindset. It is the mindset that one has to have in order to treat people and provide the resources that one would need in order to excel and advance and progress, to reach their fullest level and their highest potential. And that's what I hear when you talk about how teachers are trained differently. Oh, go over there to the special ed teacher. It's the mindset, the same mindset that a general ed teacher needs to teach students who have varying levels of, academic skills, is the same mindset that a special ed teacher, so to speak, would need to supply that patience and operate in that particular mindset. So I love the way that you said this, and this has been such a rich conversation. Today has been such a rich and meaningful conversation to so many people. And I want you to react to what you've heard today. I want you to react to some of the speakers or sessions that you've listened in on and reflect back on your own research, reflect on the work that you've done with hundreds of families and students as you help them navigate the road from K-12 to post-secondary. Just give us a few reactions on on some aha moments that you've experienced today.
Well, like I said when I started, I think today was just absolutely phenomenal. I am just so happy to be a part of today's summit. I would say one of the aha moments for me was the conversation on, oh my goodness, I can't think, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the individual, but the conversation surrounded who was in the Peace Corps, the young lady who was in the Peace Corps. I can't think of her name, and the information that came with when she needed the cane, and how when she was in I think it was Panama, they gave her the cane but nothing else. And it wasn't until she came to the Signal Center that she actually learned mobility training. And that was an aha moment for me, because I thought about how often does that happen? How often do people with disabilities are given a tool but not trained appropriately on that tool, or how to use it? And so I thought about, as she was speaking, I actually thought about Zorro. And I thought, how strategically he can do that Z. He's skilled at that. But when we give individuals a tool and don't appropriately train them on how to use it, it's just as if Zorro is just taking, and just swinging it around and have nothing to do, have no guidance, no direction. So that was very enlightening to me as a professional, and really motivated me to kind of think, okay, so that's an implication for the future. And then what was the other question?
No, I mean, you just reacting to what you heard today, some aha moments which you've given. But I want to know, you've been in this work for decades, decades. What keeps you up at night? You've seen a lot of successes, and the conversations have picked up around disability as a diversity, and you've been in this work for a really long time. But I imagine you still know how much farther we have to go. So what keeps you up at night in this space?
That's a really good question. You know, I share with you that I have a condition called Stargardt's disease, and which is a visual impairment for the audience. And I often think about, and I was one who I did not receive services in the K-12 system. I became visually impaired in my high school years, but had very accommodating teachers in my high school years. But what keeps me awake is when I think about current students who may be in a position that I was in, who may not have the accommodating teachers, who are saying, you know, who run into professors who might say, well, you know what, if I give you the PowerPoints ahead of time, it's not fair to the other students. Those possibilities keep me awake at night, because disability does not equate to, it doesn't automatically equate to an intellectual disability. If you're visually impaired, it doesn't equate to having an intellectual disability. If you're physically have a physical impairment, that doesn't equate to that. And so I would say that is my largest concern, and would keep me up, because for individuals who have non-apparent abilities and can pass, unless you know about that person, I'm concerned about how they navigate and how society receives them. That concerns me.
So I hear you clearly. That keeps you up at night, how others are treated, whether they have a visible or an invisible disability. Talk about what gives you hope for this work. What encourages you about what you've heard, what you've seen, what you've studied, what you've researched, who you've worked with, who's also waking up every day with the same heartache and heartburns that you have? What gives you hope?
Yeah, I can say the colleagues that I saw today give me hope, to know that there's someone that wakes up that has as much passion as I do, across the country, around the world, to stand and advocate on the behalf of individuals who are on the margins. And I went back and I showed the the diversity categories, and any of those categories I consider can be on the margins. And so for all advocates who advocate for those who are on the margin and strive and really work hard to pull them into the center, that gives me hope. To see panel after panel today of colleagues and experts and individuals who have disabilities to say, this is what I'm doing, this is how I advocate, that gives me hope.
And how do we further this conversation? How do we go back to our homes? How do we go back to our institutions and businesses and organizations and further this conversation so that real and meaningful change can take place for the employees and the students with whom we all are here to serve and to learn from and to encourage?
I think we all have a responsibility to be advocates, to speak up when something is said that's not right, to help change that narrative. So if you're in a conversation and someone is talking about diversity, but is leaving out that disability component, say, hey, what about disability? That's one of the diversity categories. Where does that fit in? Let's talk about that. Begin to hold people accountable for mission statements. If they're saying that this is a mission, then we need to hold people accountable. If diversity, if their mission statements has issues regarding diversity, but does not say anything about disability, we need to ask why. And it's a matter of being able and being comfortable enough to put yourself out there and ask the question, why? You may not be the favorite one all the time, but it comes with the territory. When we set up to be advocates and to really begin to think about those who are on the margins, and we want to pull those people in from the margins and bring them center, you may not always have a cheering squad behind you, and you have to be okay with that.
And how do you further the conversation when you may be at an organization or institution or business that one feels doesn't embrace it the ways that we would like to see? So how, how does an advocate become an advocate if they may be the lone person in the organization? Like, who do they lean on? How do they build those champions and get support in a space where there feels like there's no support, or in a space where there are resistors to this work?
That's an excellent question. And I really believe that is a question that is asked more than what we know. Because when we're in spaces where we feel as though no one else is in our corner, believe me, there is someone in your corner. I believe that it just takes the time for them to get the courage to come to your corner. And I would just encourage those individuals to keep advocating. Keep advocating, because at some point, someone will come and say, I got it. I got it. And I just believe that. And I see it, I've seen it in education. I've seen it in our country and social justice. When things were happening back in 2020, I've seen individuals holding up signs saying, I finally got it. And you may not be a real sign that your colleagues or your coworkers may hold, but if you keep being persistent and being okay with maybe you are the only one that's in that boat, someone is bound to say, I got it. And that's just what I believe. Just don't give up. Be persistent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I know there are so many questions that I can ask of you just based on your background, based on your experience. Are there questions that I haven't asked that you are burning to answer? Are there questions that you that may not have been asked of other presenters? There's so many questions that I know moderators and facilitators and that presenters and panelists have already discussed, but now we're at the end. Is there something that you really want the audience, the listeners to know, to hear as we close out this concluding session?
Yeah. Yes, I would like to challenge the audience to really think about your conversation. Okay, so we've had a conversation about the diversity conversation, and I'm just going to challenge the audience to think about your conversation, your diversity conversation, and just to keep that Venn diagram in front of you as you're talking and thinking, because we have to have disability included in the diversity conversation in order to have a complete conversation. We have to. And so when you're engaged in conversations, think about that. Where does this intersect? Am I thinking about, if you're in the field of education, am I thinking about my student that has cerebral palsy, but who is also an English language learner? Am I considering about what happens in that intersectionality? What are the dynamics of that intersectionality? That's what I would leave with.
Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much,
You're
Dr.
welcome.
Reed. It
You're
has been
welcome.
a pleasure getting to know you. It has been a pleasure learning more from you about your work, your research with your colleagues. And the UTC is excited to host you tomorrow, just to look at and to check out our Disability Resource Center. But you have a wealth of knowledge. And if people wanted to get in contact with you, how do they do that?
Yes, let's see. Is that my contact?
There we go.
I'm sorry. How'd you go back? Sorry about that.
Let's see.
Yeah, that's my contact information. Feel free to contact me. I look forward to communicating.
Thank you. Welcome to Chattanooga.
Thank you.
Hope you have a great stay.
Thank you.